But in the spirit of our international theme of the show, we're talking about immigration and how that's kind of impacting the housing crisis. So migration actually rose by a third last year, which lifted Australia's population by 659,000 people. So we have Melanie Macfarlane on the line, and she's going to talk, she's an immigration consultant and executive director of the International Students Education Agents Association, and she's going to talk to us about, she's going to debunk any myths about immigration and the housing crisis and just elaborate a little more about it. So, Melanie, are you there?
I am, yes, Abby.
Hi, Melanie. Thank you so much for joining us. First off the bat, can you just tell us, why is immigration in Australia so important?
Well, I mean, it's incredibly important. I think that, Australia is a land of migrants, and up until COVID, we had 26 years of economic growth, and a lot of that you can attribute to immigration because it fills skill shortages. There's an aging population in Australia, and we need young, skilled people coming into the economy.
Mm-hmm. And can you elaborate a bit more on how does it impact our economy and our society in general?
Well, I mean, as I'm alluded to now, I suppose there's an aging population, and so people are not having as many children. And if there is an aging population, you need to counter that with younger people, and there's simply the birth rate is not as high as it could be and should be, I guess, for the importance of the economy. And so immigration fills those gaps. And also there are just certain areas where there are skill shortages. And after COVID, we saw that with so many skill shortages in Australia with the borders having been closed. So yes, it's incredibly important in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And what countries are we seeing kind of the most migration from? Obviously, there's a lot of conflict in the world at the moment. How is Australia kind of communicating with that through immigration?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Of course, so much conflict, and yet there's a lot of migrants coming from the UK actually, because there's history obviously between the countries, but also other areas of Europe. Indian migrants, they make up a large portion too of migrants coming in as skilled migrants into Australia. Areas such as IT, for example. And then also other areas of Asia, China, for example. And, we've got different types of migration. For example, there's international students who are considered as temporary migrants, and then those who come in as skilled migrants. But I'd say we're getting, then Latin America is also another continent, and Africa, actually. We're getting an increasing number of migrants from that area of the world too.
Yeah, right. Okay. And just to get a little bit more in depth about the housing crisis, so what's your perspective on the relationship between immigration and the housing crisis?
I think my perspective is, I'm not an economist, obviously, but I can see that a lot has been made and perhaps blamed on immigration for this. I think we all know that this has been something that's been developing for many years, and it's something that could be attributed to perhaps the state governments, that perhaps they could have had more infrastructure in place and what have you. I know there's a lot of complex regulations around building of houses and so on, but it's a very complex problem, and I don't really feel that immigration has an awful lot to do with it, except for the fact that obviously migrants are arriving and they need housing too, but I think that immigration is unfairly blamed, actually.
Yeah, it definitely is blamed a lot in the media. And a lot of people kind of say, is a country that's already kind of struggling a bit to house all these people and provide services for people, is it equipped to support even more people that are coming in?
Well, yeah, it is a good question. I think the big thing about these big numbers that we're seeing, Abby, is that we had the borders closed. It's amazing how we forget so easily because time moves on and we all get busy. But, Australia had its borders closed for 2 years, which is significant. It was one of the only countries in the world, aside from New Zealand perhaps, and some South Pacific islands that did that. And it had big repercussions because then when the borders opened, suddenly people came flooding back in, including some students who were overseas studying and wanted to come back into the country, new international students who'd been, with all the pent-up demand that there'd been, and then all the skilled workers that had maybe been stuck outside Australia and couldn't come back in and needed to get back in, and new ones because border closure created such a skill shortage. So that's why there were such large numbers. So they are necessary to have come back into the country, and it's really the other thing is that migrants they have the skill sets which help to build houses and build and create infrastructure, such as civil engineers. 65% of engineers in Australia are from overseas, so if you want to build big infrastructure projects, well, you need engineers to do that. So I think it's a bit of a balance that we need to look at here.
Yeah, definitely. And are there any specific factors that you would consider to be more influential than immigration in driving up the house prices?
Well, I mean, I don't need to be very simplistic, but I think demand and supply is one of them. If you don't have enough houses and you have a lot of people wanting them, then clearly the house prices are going to go up because there's demand for less supply. I mean, I think that's one of them. Gosh, I don't know. Airbnb properties, for example, I've read that also, that could be somewhat of a culprit. People buying up properties and then there's a glut of them on the market, but none available for rental. All of these types of things, investment in property. I think there's a lot more to it. As I said, I think it's a very complex problem and we can't just use migrants as scapegoats.
Right. And throughout your work, have you encountered any kind of misconceptions about, well, obviously you have said that you have, but can you tell us what those misconceptions are about immigration, particularly regarding the housing crisis?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think there's certainly been lots in the media about this, and clearly housing is an issue. But international students, I think, very much, particularly, have been blamed for coming in droves and taking up places in housing. I mean, that's a bit of a myth in itself. I know the Property Commission has just released a report that actually debunks that myth completely. But the other thing is, international students, they either go into student housing or a lot of them share property, and there's quite a few of them in a very small space quite often. So I think there's a lot of misunderstandings in that regard, that migrants come in and they take houses, and it's made quite simplistic in that way, whereas in reality it really isn't as simple as that. It's really quite complex.
Right. And so finally, what policy recommendations would you suggest to address our immigration concerns and our housing crisis concerns? Like, what would you suggest that needs to be done to fix that, to create that balance, as you said?
Well, the fact of the matter is that international students at the moment are being hard hit, because I know the government is on a push to bring down the net overseas migration figure to 250,000 next program year. But so a lot of that is, I think it's a shame, because it does seem deeply political and not really related to the fact that international students and migrants actually really contribute very importantly to the economy. I mean, last year, for example, international education contributed $48 billion as an export industry, the fourth largest export industry in Australia. And some of those students are coming in to study trades, and some migrants, aside from students, are skilled and needing to come in to help to build houses and so on. So I think that it's really important that immigration stops being used as a political football, which it has been for so many years, and seems to be very much so at the moment. I think the government knows that its migration strategy means that the immigration is very important, and it would be good for it to be really recognised in that regard. And that the housing crisis is put to one side and dealt with as a separate matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Melanie, thank you so much. There were some great points there, and definitely some things to think about. So thank you so much for your expertise.